My name is Natalie Goldberg, and my project is on the prevalence and prevention of fraud in U.S. nonprofits. So I want to start off with a story about a case study that I researched for my project on the Cancer Fund of America. So over a 4-year period, this nonprofit raised $187 million, which they said went to wigs, cancer treatment, chemotherapy, and medication. But what it actually went to were lavish vacations, cars, personal expenses, and telemarketing. Unfortunately, this case is not unique within the nonprofit sector, and though we usually hear more about for-profit scandals and for-profit corporations in the news, this may not be because it's not happening in nonprofits, it may just be because we're not hearing about it. And so this case, among many others, brought up some questions that I wanted to research in my project, which is the Cancer Fund of America case just a bad apple in the nonprofit sector? Or is this happening more often than we think? And what are some of the tools and mechanisms that nonprofits have at their disposal to prevent and detect fraud within their organizations? So I wanted to get into some terminology. So a nonprofit is a state term of incorporation that an organization uses when they seek to serve a public purpose and want to be a mission-driven organization. And so they can then receive tax-exempt status through applying federally and within the state that they're incorporated. And so just to give you an idea of the influence of nonprofits across the United States, in 2016, over 1.5 million tax-exempt organizations registered with the IRS. In 2014, nonprofits accounted for 5% of US GDP, and in that same year, over $300 billion went to charities and contributions. So now we get to fraud. So the textbook definition of fraud is a knowing misrepresentation of the truth or a concealment of a material fact to induce another person to act to his or her own detriment. And so that can be a little confusing. So the key to fraud and what makes it different from something like a misrepresentation is that somebody who commits a fraudulent act does so with the intent to deceive another person and to make them act and do something harmful to themselves. And so there's several types of fraud. There's internal fraud, external fraud, and individual fraud. And for my project, I mostly focused on internal fraud, which is also known as occupational fraud. So that can include something like corruption, misappropriation of assets, or financial statement fraud. So what you need to remember is that a nonprofit has an intent to provide a public benefit, and fraud, somebody who commits fraud, has an intent to deceive. And so within my project, I wanted to see what fraud looked like, the prevalence of fraud in the nonprofit sector, and prevention and detection mechanisms in the same sector. And so to do so, for prevalence, I looked at past studies that sought to quantify fraud in the US nonprofit sector and worldwide. And for prevention and detection, I looked at external and internal controls. So for the purpose of my study, external controls include policy and regulations on a state and federal level, and internal controls are voluntary best business practices or ethical business practices that nonprofits can voluntarily put in place. And so the way that I researched this is through some background research, but also I interviewed some nonprofit executives and looked into some case studies of fraud in US nonprofits. And so getting into the prevalence, I looked at 2 different studies that found 40 cases in 2014 and 52 cases in 2016 of nonprofit fraud on a worldwide scale. But really, I wanted to focus on the United States. And so I found one study that found 115 cases between 2008 and 2011. Now, looking at all these numbers, it's kind of hard for me to determine exactly what the scope of fraud is in the US nonprofit sector. And that mostly has to do with the fact that either these numbers are found from media reports, which means that the fraud was already published, or it was found through surveys, which means that people are already in these nonprofits, but on a worldwide scale. And so really, the answer is we don't know how prevalent fraud is in the nonprofit sector. And based on the studies and the publicly available information, I was unable to determine that within my study. But I do have recommendations for that going forward because this is a bit concerning. And so even though we may not be able to determine the prevalence of fraud in the nonprofit sector, there are controls put in place that try to detect and prevent it. And so when nonprofits have to register, they can do so federally and also on a state level. And so the IRS Form 990 is a tax-exempt form that nonprofits fill out. And in 2008, they added some additional questions to actually fight fraud in the sector. And one of those questions included whether a nonprofit has experienced a diversion of assets within the past year. Now, nonprofits have an incentive to lie about the answer to this question. And the reason why they can do so is because, first of all, if they say, yes, there has been a diversion of assets, and this form is made public, people will be less inclined to donate to the organization. And secondly, they can because the IRS just doesn't have the capacity to go into every nonprofit and determine whether or not what they're saying on their forms are truthful. However, there is a lot more oversight on a state level. So in 41 states, nonprofits have to register if they want to solicit within a state. They also have to refile that annually or biannually in all of those states. And within those as well, there are 29 states that require nonprofits to conduct an independent audit. But the concern about these regulations is that they're not standardized across every state. And so nonprofits constantly have to figure out how to remain compliant in all of the states. They have to figure out what registration forms they have to fill out, when they're due, how to file them, how much it costs. And so that places a large burden on nonprofits. And so what I've learned through my research is that internal controls are really the mechanisms that can help detect and prevent fraud in a nonprofit, not so much the external policy. Now, internal controls, as I mentioned, are voluntary, and they can include things such as a separation of duties, having an ethical culture, having a fraud hotline, employee education, maintaining a whistleblower policy, and having a conflict of interest policy. And so through the interviews, when I talk to nonprofit executives, one of the main points that one of them mentioned to me is that it's not the job of a financial department in a nonprofit to seek out fraud. That's not their day-to-day job, that's not their day-to-day responsibility. But what they do is a risk analysis of the nonprofit, and they find areas where fraud could possibly happen, and they put these controls in place to make it detectable and therefore also preventable. And so the government, again, does not require nonprofits to put these in place, but they choose to do so anyway because it boosts their image, it helps their reputation, and it can make them seem more transparent and accountable. And so I also wanted to see how fraud manifests itself within the nonprofit sector when a case does come out publicly. And so we already talked about the Cancer Fund of America case, which was a total sham charity. From the executives to the actual charity itself, it was completely fraudulent. But there are cases where there's a legitimate nonprofit, where there's an executive who steals money from that nonprofit. And so in the case of Jonathan Dunning, he conspired to steal $14 million from a nonprofit in Alabama that was helping low-income residents receive health care. And so the nonprofit itself is legitimate and still functioning today, but he himself committed fraud against them. And lastly, there was a government collaboration case called Operation False Charity Sweep, where the federal government, along with all 50 states and DC, decided to file class action lawsuits against police, veterans, and firefighter organizations that were completely sham charities. And so 85 to 90% of the contributions given to these charities across the country were going back into for-profit telemarketing. And just to give you an idea of the scope of the damage that this caused, there was one nonprofit in particular in California that out of the $30 million that it raised, it said 100% of that was going to the cause. Only about 23,000 made it even somewhat there. And so this brings up some further implications and questions about nonprofit fraud, and especially within the United States. So in terms of policy reform, as I mentioned before, the state regulations are not standardized, and so this puts a large burden on nonprofits to either hire people to figure out what forms they need to fill out. They're paying all these different fees, and so there needs to be a better streamlined and efficient process for nonprofits to register because they have limited resources, and they need to be using those resources to the cause or in order to put better management practices in place. And secondly, there's also talk about whether there should be a regulation for nonprofits similar to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act for-profit corporations that would require them to put in more financial programs and different committees. But then there's also people who argue that nonprofits need to be self-regulated. And so that's a question back and forth. Secondly, with nonprofit fraud statistics. So I mentioned that there's no public database about nonprofits that have committed fraud or nonprofits to look out for. And so should the government be collecting this information? Can they even collect it? And should that data be made public, or will that make people less inclined to donate to a charity? And lastly, talking about donations, people say, it's up to the donors. The donors are the ones who need to go online and they need to look up a charity, they need to read their financials, and they need to be the ones to make a decision about whether or not a charity is legitimate. But the question is that they're using these watchdog organization sites like Charity Navigator, Charity Watch, Better Business Bureau, which are nonprofits themselves. And they're all using different parameters and equations to come up with whether or not a nonprofit is legitimate. And so the question is are they reliable? And do they actually affect donor behavior? And some studies have shown that they actually don't, and that people will donate anyway, even with a bad rating. And so ultimately, legitimate nonprofits, they intend to provide a public benefit. Fraud harms the viability of the nonprofit sector and its reputation, and nonprofits should be given the tools and resources that they need to prevent fraud and serve their purposes, and donors should be able to feel confident in their contributions. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I will now open up the floor to questions. Yeah.
I thought that was, excuse me, very interesting. I have a question for you on a slightly different note. One of the ways of explaining the prevalence of fraud in nonprofits is that nonprofits have much weaker governance procedures and much weaker kinds of market controls than a public company. And you can see this in a variety of different ways. It isn't that fraud doesn't occur in public companies, we know it does, and we know all kinds of unethical behavior can break out in any kind of environment, public or private. But governance does make a difference. Is that something you considered in terms of the discrepancy between rules of public companies versus nonprofits?
Yeah, so there was a study that was done about whether or not the Sarbanes-Oxley Act should apply to nonprofits, or if they should create a new legislation that's a similar form tailored to the nonprofit sector itself. And I mean, in that study in particular, the researchers said no, because it was just, it's too much of a burden on them, and they wouldn't be able to like put money towards the cause if they were putting it into creating something like an audit committee, for example. Though I do think it is possible in some of the larger nonprofits. It just depends on what the size is. And so when I talk about internal controls like separation of duties, that's something that's a lot easier to put in place in a larger nonprofit versus one that's run by 3 people. But you also see that in companies as well, and companies may not necessarily have to follow all of those rules either. So that act in particular is really only for corporations and if they incorporate. So. Sure, Professor Zatlin.
Yeah, you mentioned that there was a lot of variation, not only that there are some states that don't require anything, but that you have 41 that do require something. Could you tell us a little bit about that variation and how you understand why states choose different paths?
Sure. So depending on like what whether or not the state has the capacity to really monitor the nonprofits is a huge factor in that. So for example, I interviewed somebody from the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions, and they just created a new bureau and got new staff that are now able to monitor nonprofits in their state. Whereas somewhere like Delaware, for example, which has no regulations whatsoever, it's also pretty similar to how they act with corporations as well. And so I think that if these states aren't able to really monitor corporations and businesses, they're not going to put in extra controls for nonprofits as well. They just don't have the capacity for it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The question I guess I'm asking is,
Sure.
Is it an ideological reason? Is there a financial strategy? What accounts for these variations? Why would Delaware go one route and Wisconsin go a totally different route, especially if it's going to cost the state money?
Well, I think that it does have to do with money, and that probably is the biggest factor. I think that if they were to want to regulate nonprofits more within their state, they'd have to bring on more staff, and they'd have to create an entirely new office to do that. Right now, it's monitored by the Attorney General's office and sometimes the Secretary of State within those states. And so if they believe that that's enough and that that's sufficient, then that's just how they're going to keep it. But in Wisconsin, for example, they were part of the Cancer Fund of America. They played a large role in that case and in suing the different nonprofits involved in that case. And following that case is really when they started adding on more regulations and changing their regulations as well.
I believe that's all we
Tyler?
have time for.
Oh, okay. Last one.